So I am really intrigued by the provocative messaging here about New Detroit and what it wants to do, declaring war on racism. Let's start with that language and why you chose such provocative imagery for what you want to do.
Mm-hmm. I guess the best way to start is we've been a nation, we've been one nation for so long, experiencing race and racism, but our views of it and the problems that come from it, the views of our problems and the views of racism itself have been so fragmented, as have the challenges that come from racism. And because of that fragmentation, historic fragmentation, we find ourselves at a time where people are starting to come together with a common acknowledgement that it's a problem without, I would say, a strong direction, and without, a lot of, good steps and necessary steps to take to eliminate this problem that I think we're all starting to realize collectively is something that affects us all. And so it was important for us to have a singular statement, much like the war on poverty, or much like the war on drugs, or the war on terrorism, that continued to galvanize people in a common direction.
Do you feel as though that is significantly different than it was before? This idea of people coming together around the idea that this is a problem. I always worry that when we see massive demonstrations, when we have this conversation about inequality or racism, systemic racism, that we're talking to each other about this, that those of us who get it and who feel like these are, signature problems in American society, are talking to other people who feel the same way, and that we're not really reaching the people who don't understand or don't or who don't want to. But this time I've heard a lot of people say that it seems broader and that it seems to be pulling people in who weren't in before. Is that your experience as well?
It is, and I think I share your caution, but this is a time, and in the conversation or the work around racial justice, hope is I think far more necessary than most other industries. And a lot of us are still cautious, but a lot of us are still becoming more optimistic and more hopeful, having heard the NFL make a few changes, and NASCAR and others. My concern, quite frankly, is that that's PR, rather than real systems change, which is part of the reason why it was so timely and important for us to, have such a bold declaration to get people to, stay on course and stay on path, rather than have the media cycles sort of, dictate the passion and momentum around anti-racism. I get concerned when I hear, our president, say some of the things that he said recently, about, death by police and how, there's no disparity and things like that. So, I mean, because of the fragmentation that I mentioned earlier, I do go back and forth between hope and optimism about, around where we stand right now. But it just means that all of us who happen to be on the side that you mentioned, who talk about this stuff with such passion and urgency, that we continue to beat the drum and we continue to bring people back to the focus.
Yeah. So let's talk specifically about this announcement of a war on racism. What will that mean? And what is the hope for substantive change there? What are the things that you're looking at as indicators that we might be winning the war on racism?
Yeah, well, so there are some very practical first steps that were laid out in the declaration, having individuals start doing the work on themselves being one of them, right? I mean, we see captains of industry across the country say that they're committed to anti-racism now. I guarantee that many of them go back to their boardrooms and go back to their offices and say, okay, and wipe the sweat off their head, but now what do I do? The very first step is working on yourself, and that's laid out in the declaration. Beyond that, treating your organization and your institution, as an anti-racist establishment. And that means looking at anti-racism and the move toward it as important as the bottom line. Applying some of the same things that you do to your organizational focus, on the bottom line, like continuous improvement, and like doing, audits and understanding the data, around your bottom line is part of the success of many organizations. Doing the same sort of thing toward anti-racism is important. The amount of investment that needs to go into anti-racism and anti-racist work is substantial because it's so systemic, because racism is so systemic. And anytime we've ever had a big problem in this country or in the world, whether it's, mobility, getting from the East Coast to the West Coast, a massive capital improvement, a capital investment went into that. Getting to the moon, a massive capital investment went into that, dismantling, public health crises and issues like cancer, focusing on research. There was so much research and investment in that. Beyond that, there needs to be investment into the space of researching ways to deal with racism and building the right interventions. And, so I'm hoping, those three next steps, people start really focusing on themselves, people start really deeply focusing on their institutions, and then people start really investing in, anti-racism as a practice. I'm hoping those three things happen and happen quickly.
Yeah. When we talk about this issue and particularly the work on self, the work on your own space, I think you're right that for a lot of people that's puzzling. I would imagine that New Detroit is there in part to help educate people about what that means. You get a lot of people who mean well and say, I do want things to be different, but when they think about their own lives, when they think about their own institutions, there's a little bit of a barrier to confronting some of the things that might be embarrassing, might be difficult to solve. And I would imagine that New Detroit is, at least here, especially saying, hey, we can help shine a light on this stuff for you.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, I've been here for about a year now, and the organization's been around for 50 plus years. And, we've developed tools, to have uncomfortable conversations. We're continuing to, we're taking the continuous improvement approach to our organization, the same way that we're calling other businesses to around anti-racism. We're building tools and continue to build tools to address this. Racism is a continuum. The interventions needed to address anything in a continuum also have to be comprehensive. So we're building things out for that. And, furthering that, I would say part of there's such a problem with racism, and there is such a stigma attached to it, right? And doing the personal work is hard, in part because there's such a stigma. If anyone's called an alcoholic or called mentally ill or whatever the case, the stigma that's attached to that makes it difficult for people to move into onto a journey of improvement, and it gets that much more compounded by more people in a whole institution, and there's risk attached to it, and that's one of the reasons it makes it such a hard thing to change. But we have to build out something that's for everybody and for every institution, and something that even gets to the point where if it's risky or if it feels uncomfortable to have these conversations, we have something for that too. So there's a continuous improvement on our side. There's a continuous improvement with our partners. There are many, many people individually and organizationally that are focused on this work, and we're all thinking right now about how to approach this with urgency.
You can find more at onedetroitpbs.org or subscribe to our social media channels and sign up for our One Detroit newsletter.